Hey, it's Minute Book Reports, and this is my one book haul video for the next book that I'm going to read for this YouTube channel. And that book is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. And I want to just sort of explain some of the reasons why I want to read this book and what I'm looking forward to going into this book. So why am I reading this book? Well, basically, I saw that it was an upcoming book, and it seemed to be very popular. And I look at a book in terms of being popular when a film company, when a studio decides to buy the rights to make a movie for that book. And I noticed that this book was picked up from the same people who produced the movies for Divergent, which I haven't seen the movies yet of Divergent, but to me that represents a somewhat of a commitment and at least potential in what they see this book can be. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the book is going to be great, but it does to me signify that people are paying attention to this book. I also noticed that the author was somehow associated with Barnes& and Noble, which is a bookstore I used to work for way long time ago. But it always interests me that you have an author who is associated with basically a bookstore, and they're able to somehow make that connection to produce and publish their own book. So I'm very much excited to see what that person is able to do, what Melissa is able to do with this book, and I want to sort of eventually down the road see if they end up making the film. So what do I think the book is about? Well, I really have no idea. I didn't read any of the previews. I know that there's like excerpts and things, but just based on the title and kind of a general understanding of what I think is going to happen, I think it's going to be some kind of fairy tale. That's what it sounds like. Probably a young girl who, living today, she somehow stumbles across this fairy tale woods, I guess, that she meets fairy tale characters. That's just my total guess. I really have no idea. But that's nice. You know, one of the things I like about doing these preview videos in the beginning is that I can look back and see how correct, but mostly wrong I am about my expectations about the books. But I've always felt like it's nice to not go into books with high expectations. You know, I've mentioned that I read primarily for fun. And by reading for fun, it really makes every book enjoyable. Now, there's books that I definitely didn't like versus ones that I preferred more, but I would never say that it was a waste of my time to read a book. And that's why when it comes to books, you know, that are brand new to me, I don't mind not knowing anything about what the book's going to be about. So what about the book cover? Well, I noticed that the book cover has this, I think it's like a gold foil. It's sort of like a vintage, but also like a old, maybe like a early 1920s, 1930s type of look. It kind of reminds me of like The Great Gatsby. The film had like that very, I don't know what you call it, that type of stenciling where it's very liney. It's very like simple shapes, but you understand what those things are. This book cover has an interesting twist because it brings about a lot of images that you would associate with fairy tales. You know, you have, I think in the corner you have like the dagger with the dripping going down, and then you have that sort of the house castle thing going on in the top in the background. But you also have like a car and a sidewalk, and so you have a lot of these more modern things, which is why I'm thinking it's about a modern time female protagonist who goes into this sort of Chronicles of Narnia style world where she's able to interact with some fairy tale characters. So I think that's what's going to happen, but I'm a big fan of when covers have a certain style that isn't just straight up text. You know, I mentioned in a previous video about Artemis, I like that cover because the text was very asteroids. You know, it was very, very old school. And in this sort of story, we have a very classic, again, vintage fairy tale type of cover and font, and that's something that I think stands out on the bookshelf. You know, again, in a market that, you know, it's very, very bland. You know, you just have big bold font, and then you got maybe some kind of picture, one quick thing. But in this one, it looks like it's an authentic old book, like it's going to be a storybook, and that's sort of what draws me into the story. So I'm very excited about that. And what do I hope to get out of this book? Well, you know, I wish that I would have watched Once Upon a Time, the TV series, when it came out. You know, one of my coworkers told me about this story or about the show, and she was saying how the story has all these different fairy tale characters, and they're kind of living in this city, and you get these cool references. And I've done sort of some fairy tale stuff in it for this YouTube channel in stories and books that I've covered, but I wish I would have watched the story or watched the show back then, because I feel like now I can never catch up. But I really like the idea of combining fairy tales with today, or modernizing fairy tales into things that we can understand, because I think we often grow up with Disney versions of these fairy tales, which is fine for kids, but we never really revisit those fairy tales back to the original text, and oftentimes they're extremely different, and we miss a lot of the nuances because they're not all Disneyed up, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we don't go back and we actually understand the story. Like when I went back and I reread Cinderella, I was like totally surprised what the story actually was versus what we see in the movie. I mean, the Disney film is very fun and colorful, but in the story, it's pretty rough. It's pretty bad. So I'm hoping that in this story, the main character interacts with these fairy tale figures that we are familiar with, but that we may not necessarily know in their real capacity in the original stories. And so what I'm hoping to get out of this story is that type of interaction where the main character, today person, right, will be able to interact with these caricatures or these fictional characters who are locked into what we perceive them to be. But as they develop in the story, we learn a little bit more about them, and it changes our views on the fairy tale that they're associated with. So you're talking about Three Pigs, you're talking about all these different characters that we, Snow White, that we just assume so much about them. But I'm hoping that through this story, that the author shares new insight into their characters. So it's not just a story about the girl, who I assume is the main character, but it's a story about all these other characters, and maybe it'll be something where it's one of those themes where it's like, yeah, we never thought about them in that way. I'm thinking about Maleficent, I'm thinking about Wicked, where we get new perspectives on characters that we just assumed were bad people. They're bad guys, they're villains, you know, they're the antagonists of the story. But maybe this will shine a light on them, and they could still be a villain or an antagonist, but at least it'll shine a new light on them and make it that much more deep and enjoyable, so that we get to understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. So that's what I hope to get out of this book. So I'll be making reading updates as I continue to read the book, but I wanted to just sort of make this preview video to sort of share what I'm going to read, some of my thoughts going into it, and I'm really excited about this book because it's a new book. And so thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.